Joining me here in our visual radio studio to talk a little bit about the job that he does at San Juan Regional Medical Center, the chaplain at the hospital, Tod Smith, is here. Mr. Smith, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming in to talk a little bit about the job that you do. And we were talking before we came on the air this morning that you are somewhat new to Farmington, though you've been here for a couple of years now,
right? 6.5 years.
Yeah,
okay.
So not so new,
yeah.
But newer than me, I guess. We'll compare it that way. But
yeah.
You're enjoying it.
Yeah.
And but your background is a little bit in pastoral services, and then doing this, and then a bunch of other odd jobs, this and that you were telling me.
A little bit, yeah. I
can fix my squeaky door if I put you to work,
yeah,
right?
I did some handyman work along the way just to get through graduate school.
Right.
And so forth. I was a pastor, a congregational pastor, non-denominational, for really over 30 years. Different contexts, but never. And I went to a Baptist seminary. I'll put that out there.
Mm-hmm.
But I never really thought of myself that way as a Baptist. I went to Denver Theological Seminary, which at the time was a Baptist school, and I think they're more independent now, but I went there because, I mean, who doesn't want to go to Denver, right? I lived in Kansas, and I actually had friends who were going there, and it was actually cheaper than the other two schools I was looking at. So
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so I ended up in Denver.
But this is something that you always had a calling for, you feel, or at least helping others? And
yeah, and I appreciate you saying that, because though I'm not a congregational pastor anymore, I still feel very much like a pastor in who I am and just my wiring, I guess.
And that's a special type of person, I think, that has that insight and that drive to help other people in this way. Yeah,
it seems to be something that I don't necessarily just turn on and off. It's kind of an intuitive sort of a thing that I pick up on where people are coming from, what the temperature is in a room, and those kinds of things. I don't know if they're gifts or if it's something I learned as a kid. I don't really know.
Right.
But I will say that as part of my internship in my seminary years, I did almost a year's worth of volunteer on an oncology unit in a hospital in Wichita, Kansas, as a volunteer chaplain, essentially. I followed another guy around. I didn't know what I was doing, but at the end of that almost year, I had fallen in love with it. I really just enjoyed my time and learned a lot. And they actually offered me a position at the end of that. It was a Catholic hospital, and I would have been the first non-Catholic full-time chaplain they'd ever hired. But
they overlooked that Baptist part? Is that what they did?
I don't know. Maybe they missed that. I don't know. But we had other plans, so I declined and kind of went along with life. But I've never forgotten that experience.
Sure.
Then over the years. And I don't know if this happens in other professions or not, but it certainly was the case for me that from time to time, I would find myself thinking, gee, I wonder what else I might want to do. If I was in maybe a church context where things weren't going as smoothly as I wanted, or the programs that I was trying to put together weren't happening or whatever, I'd think, hey, maybe I should do something else, and chaplaincy would always kind of rattle around in the back of my head. But I knew that you had to do something to get there, and there's an educational program called Clinical Pastoral Education, CPE, that you have to do, and I didn't know what it was. I just knew that it was a sort of an academic program, but it was always in the context of a hospital. That always seemed unfair to me, that to become a hospital chaplain, you had to go to this program in a hospital. It just somehow didn't make sense to me, so I resisted it. Until I found myself really kind of at a point after a long transition out of congregational ministry. I found myself at a place where I had to go back to something that I knew how to do, and chaplaincy was the closest thing. I didn't want to go back to the church. I knew that, but I was in a secular context, and I was not performing well. It just wasn't my niche. And actually, part of the reason was I was in a call center for an insurance company. And my wife was doing the same thing. She would take 40, 50 calls a day. And on the way home, we'd talk and kind of debrief, and she'd say, so how many calls did you take? And I'd say, 12.
Whoops.
Yeah, whoops.
Right.
And part of the reason was I'm not very good at multitasking. You have to kind of type and chat while you're doing all that. But the other thing was, inevitably, I'd come across one or two people during the day on the phone who were in some kind of crisis. And I just couldn't help myself but begin to pull that out of them, to find out, well, what's going on in your life. Do you have support? Do you have family around? How are you going to do this? And often it was somebody's policy was canceling because their spouse had always paid the bills, and now they're gone. And so they were in this crisis mode. So I'd have to kind of patch that all together. But again, it was me being their pastor, and it was just something I couldn't really help.
Yeah, through the phone, though. That's
Through the phone.
Unique, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, it was a little bit unique.
Yeah.
So my boss finally came and said, you got to find another job. I don't want to fire you. They liked me. They were very gracious and generous to me. And so that's when I looked at a clinical pastoral education program there in Des Moines, Iowa, and sort of, sucked it up and applied, and I was accepted. So it's a 12-month residency program, academic and clinical at the same time. A really challenging year of functioning as a chaplain and learning a lot about myself, more about myself than I sometimes wanted to.
And working in a hospital, too,
in a hospital,
right?
yeah,
in
functioning
Des Moines,
in Des Moines, Iowa. It was,
Okay.
I think it's called Unity Point now, but it was a Methodist hospital system, and it was a pretty good sized hospital, 400 bed hospital with a children's hospital attached to it, and a couple of then satellite units as well.
Okay.
But yeah, it was, in the first quarter was like, oh my gosh, what have I got myself into? And then the second, third, and fourth quarters, it really just, I realized I've just got to jump in. You can't dabble at this. You just really have to throw yourself in to benefit from the process of sort of this internal formation that goes on that is important when you're sitting with somebody in a hospital room later. And so you kind of understand what's going on inside of you, because sometimes it's not very pleasant, it's not very fun, sometimes it's disturbing, and sometimes they even say things or do things that could be provocative, and how do I respond? So those were the kinds of issues that we were working at, sort of uncovering, as well as refining and clarifying for myself, what is my faith? What is it that I really hold to? Yeah, okay, I guess if you boiled me down, maybe I'm a Baptist, my bones, but what does that mean? And what is it about that I'm unwilling to let go of, and that in the end, from deep within me, guides me as I interact with patients, families, staff of all different faiths or no faith, because it's not my role to shove things down their throats. And in fact,
that's the doctor's role.
That's the doctor's role, and the nurses, yeah.
Those little sticks and
that's
things.
right.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm kind of rambling here a little bit,
okay.
but
But this is what gets you to where you are today.
Yeah, and one of the things I learned along the way, it's kind of my mantra, is the older I get, the more I realize how little I know. And when I came to that realization, there was great peace for me to finally think, I don't have to know it all. I don't have to have all the right answers. I don't have to fix this person. That's not my job. I could sort of go off on my theological point of view and just say that, really simply, from the scriptures, the two things that I hold on to most tightly. Someone asked Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And he said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul. And he said, the second one is like it. They didn't ask him, but he said, the second one is like it. And that is to love your neighbor as yourself. So to me, love God, love people. Those are my marching orders every day. And some days I do it better than others, and I'm learning as I go.
Sounds like what we all find at work, I think.
I think so, yeah.
That's very true. And so here you are now as a chaplain for the last 6.5 years at San Juan Regional Medical Center. And so your job is to then talk to patients, talk to their families, talk to staff who may be needing someone to talk to and offer assistance and help through whatever issues that they're facing. Is that the idea?
Absolutely. Yeah. On any given day, I may have requests from patients and families for me to come visit, anywhere from 5 to 15, and that's I don't know if I've ever actually seen 15 patients in a day. 9 or 10 is really about max, because
Sure.
Part of the luxury of having a chaplain in a hospital for the hospital is that we can take our time. We're not on, the nurses have these, things they have to do. They're, time sensitive.
During their shift.
During their shift, time sensitive stuff. And they're maxed out. They've got maybe, 5 or 6 patients that they're racing from room to room to check on and, apply meds, check vitals, make sure they've ordered their meals and, clean them, whatever they've got to do, get them to their next procedure. But I have the luxury of sitting and engaging and just taking that time to allow someone to begin to unfold and open up what's going on.
And that can take some time, I would think, too, right? Maybe people, if they've never met you before, it takes
Sure.
a little while to open up or maybe really
talk
about what's really going on.
Yeah, and honestly, a lot of people, I think what I've discovered, too, is a lot of people just want to chat. They just want to talk about church, or they just want to, and so those aren't necessarily the ones I hope to spend my time with. And part of the challenge is identifying patients who are experiencing some kind of spiritual distress, and that's sort of a technical term in the sense that it is really because of what's going on in their life. There's an inability to sort of integrate the things that have been important to them in the past, meaning and purpose, and maybe they're feeling disconnected from God or from people, their family. They're isolated and alone in the hospital, and so sometimes my role is to sit with them and identify some of that, and maybe begin to draw out of them some things that they can identify as resources that they didn't realize they had. Again, it's not up to me to fix them. And sometimes I want to. Sometimes I say, well, if you just do this or that, or here, read this book. You can't do that. Mm-hmm. But through subtle interaction and engagement and taking the time, sometimes you're able to kind of redirect somebody to, maybe their faith. And you even said it, I think, earlier, either on or off the air, but, people come to the hospital and maybe they haven't participated or practiced or engaged in their faith. Not even sure that they are people of faith, but they get there and all of a sudden they start thinking, I was baptized a Catholic. I was baptized, when I was a little kid, or my parents used to take me to this church. And so they begin to kind of reach way back and they pull on some of that. And I'm pretty sure that, I'd say probably, and this is just a guess, I have no idea, but I would say most people come to the hospital and at some point in that experience, they're going to say in their head or in their heart, they're going to say, God, help me. What's going on? Why? Why is this happening?
Right.
Well, where are you? Which is not unlike many of the Psalms that in the Bible that start out, God, where are you? Don't you care? Why aren't you listening? And that's what it feels like sometimes, is kind of despair. So that's a big part of what I do, is visit with those folks. And yes, staff, gosh, you can't do what those folks do every day, for 12-hour shifts, back-to-back sometimes, without having some kind of an impact on them emotionally, spiritually. And I'm not talking religious stuff. I'm talking about just deep inside that, anxiety and worry and fatigue. And they need to be looked after. And sometimes they'll ask to talk to me. Or sometimes I'll just stop at a nurse's station and engage with somebody. And sometimes those little antennas go up and I'll say, boy, you just seem really tired. Are you doing okay today? And yeah, it's kind of uncanny sometimes how that happens.
Sure. And I think a lot of us get our knowledge of what goes on inside a hospital, if we're not a patient there, haven't visited a patient there, maybe from television or movies or things like that, which may or may not be accurate. I completely understand that. But my point in making that comparison is that it is probably a nonstop active place, whether you're in the emergency department or on some of the medical floors. I mean, there's a lot of activity going on all the time, it seems to me. I haven't spent a lot of time in a hospital. And so with all that going on, I can see where maybe the staff would reach out to talk to you, or patients would certainly want to talk to you, or things like that. And they're facing all types of different things. If I'm a nurse or a doctor and I've lost a patient, that takes a toll. And if I'm a family member who's got relative in the hospital with a pretty serious diagnosis, that takes a toll as well. It's all these different things that are going on that you are being called upon to help with, correct? And I guess you never know what you're walking into necessarily in some of these cases.
No, I don't. And I try to gather some information if I can before I go in, but it's a lot of times, most times, it's going in blind a little bit.
Right.
And maybe sometimes there's an advantage to that, so that really I am allowing that person or that family to kind of begin to set the tone and the agenda and the direction that they want to go.
Sure. And do you try to find out at the beginning of maybe your conversation if the family has any religious connections and what area that may be, whether it's Catholic or Protestant or something else, maybe, so you can maybe fine-tune your help?
Exactly. I have a little model that I sort of carry in my head that it's actually an assessment model or tool that was developed, I don't know how many years ago, by a physician at George Washington University Hospital in D.C., Christina Pachowski, and it's called FICA, F-I-C-A. And I just kind of have that as an outline for myself that, I'll at some point, and it's not mechanical, it just sort of leaks out of the conversation, but I'm listening for, is there a faith orientation? And sometimes I just have to come right out and ask them.
Right.
Sure. Do you have a faith? Is there something that you've aligned yourself with? And then the I is, what is the importance or the influence of that in their life? And then the C is, do they have any kind of community around them, or are they part of a community? And that's looking at supportive structures outside the hospital. And then the A is simply, okay, so what are my actions? What's my assessment? And what's my not so much an agenda, but how am I going to address this with this patient? And sometimes it's, ideally, it'd be nice if I could get everything resolved in one visit, but a lot of times I may need to follow up with that patient the next day or in 2 days from now. And that sometimes is a challenge, just because there's more patients sometimes than I can see in a day. So to get back to another one for a second visit sometimes is a challenge. But yeah, that's sort of the approach that I take.
Sure. Well, and it seems to work very well.
I'm still learning and growing, because then out of that experience, and I don't sit there and take too many notes, I may jot something down, but I have to remember to be able to bring that back and enter that intervention, I guess, that I've brought to that patient and family. I have to enter that into the electronic medical record, and in a way and in language that if a nurse or a doctor or a physical therapist were to look at my notes and wanted to see what others were doing and saying, that they would understand what I did and why and what the result was.
But I would imagine that sharing of that information, confidentially, of course, with other folks involved with that patient, can help them maybe in their other interactions with that patient, knowing what you've talked with them about or what they've shared with you, and
yeah.
Vice
Well,
versa.
I mean, we all, whether you're a physician or the nurse or the therapist or whatever you are, even nutritionists, everyone's putting their information into this chart.
Right.
We are a multidisciplinary team, and that's something that's kind of exciting about chaplaincy right now. In some ways, I think chaplaincy is an industry or a discipline very much in transition, because, and this is just caveat, these are just my observations and my words. I haven't picked this up necessarily anywhere, but it seems to me that for many, many years, decades, maybe a century or more, I don't know, chaplaincy sort of was okay, just kind of being over there. Nobody really cared what they did or knew what they did, and chaplains didn't really care if anybody knew what they did, or they didn't have to document anything necessarily.
Somewhat independent of everything else.
Kind of independent, sort of in the shadows of mystery and faith. It was sort of a different thing.
Okay.
Well, a number of years ago, the systems within medical care shifted from sort of a value based on quantity, how many people did I see, to the quality, and sort of saying, well, what is the result of what I've done? And so everything has to be measured, demonstrated, and documented. So the discipline of chaplaincy or spiritual care is really way behind the curve in terms of research and being able to demonstrate the value of what we do. However, having said that, the vast majority of studies and surveys, whether formal or informal, are clearly demonstrating positive correlations between chaplain visits, spiritual care visits with patients' families, and patient satisfaction scores afterwards, and that's
Right.
a big deal for hospitals. We get reimbursed on these kinds of things. And there are improvements even in clinical outcomes. People get better faster when their spiritual concerns are attended to. compliance. When people, here's your your medicine. This is what you have to do, and often with our support, they're more inclined to follow through with that. So there's really, it's kind of an amazing thing to think about.
Right. Well,
go ahead.
And a lot more, I guess, too, from just relying solely on the medication, maybe, and some of the other things, but having that all-encompassing healing plan for a patient. And that comes to mind with the recent renovations at San Juan Regional. There's a healing garden now, and so that's something that maybe other hospitals haven't always had, and some place where you can go. And the idea that maybe it's more than just what happens in the operating room to help heal that patient, and faith and that belief system is an important maybe part of that. I guess if someone comes to you and their faith has been shattered or threatened perhaps, and if you can turn that around and give them a reason to believe again, that could help in their recovery.
I think so. There's a great quote that I picked up out of an article somewhere a while back that says, "Long before the world had licensed physicians, it had healers." That always kind of gives me goosebumps a little bit to think that I'm in some ways thrown into that category. I'm not a curer. I can't cure disease, but I can in some ways bring a level of healing through that interaction, through that. And there is a mystical part that we'll never fully understand, I hope.
Right.
I hope we never try to squeeze that out of it, but I think it's there. The majority of patients, and again, this is surveys and studies have shown this, come to a hospital, want someone to engage them around their religious or spiritual concerns as it relates to their illness and their treatment. They may not, and usually don't have the language to articulate that coming in, but when asked and when surveyed, they will say, yes, I want somebody to do that. And they actually would prefer their doctors do it. Doctors are reluctant to do it because of time and often training. They don't feel equipped. But what's interesting is, as I said, most people come in and want that. But on the flip side, most people leaving don't get it, haven't had that. And that's a disconnect that's really unfortunate, that we're not paying attention to that. We say we want to provide whole person care. And so I'm really happy and honored that San Juan Regional has a chaplain, has kept a chaplain. And honestly, chaplain departments are often vulnerable in times when times are lean. Because they've been always perceived as a non-revenue generating department, which is, I guess, in one sense true, but yet I'm not sure who actually generates revenue in a hospital. We get reimbursed for the things that we do through insurance and those kinds of things. But
we hear all the time ROI, that return on investment.
Return on investment.
Hard is that to maybe show what it is that you do?
Actually, I just watched a webinar a couple of weeks ago on that, on return on investment and how do you apply those principles to what we do. And this webinar was really kind of fleshing that out. And I'm working with some folks in the quality department to maybe help come up with some ideas how to do that, to not only improve what I do and the systems and the mechanisms that go into that, but how do we measure the outcome, what comes out on the other side. And so I'm excited to see where it goes. But as I was saying, I'm just really honored that our hospital recognizes the value and the importance of this.
Very good. Well, and again, I know there's a lot of folks believe in the power of prayer, and I scroll through my Facebook page, and and there's a lot of folks that are praying for others in our community who may be going through struggles, whether it's health related or others. And I imagine you see that a lot as well, and that can really maybe turn a patient around sometimes if they know there's a lot of folks pulling for them and praying for them and thinking about them and all those types of things.
And I will say, from a theological perspective, I don't really understand prayer. I'll just be honest with you. It's not magic. It's not rubbing a genie bottle. I wish it was that easy sometimes. But it seems as if, more often than not, the things that we ask for that we don't necessarily, we don't get it. It's not to say that we're not given answers or something, but it doesn't always go our way. But one thing that seems consistent, as I pray with patients in particular, is that when we pray, it somehow seems like we're opened up in a spiritual way that allows God to touch us. I hardly day goes by where I would say almost a patient, hardly a patient goes by that I haven't prayed with who doesn't shed tears in the midst of that prayer. And it's not because I'm so cool, and I mean, I often find myself flapping my gum saying the same thing I said in the room just before, because praying with, 10 people a day, kind of in the same context, it gets hard to stay creative, and I don't know these people that well.
Right. But something's happening.
But something happens,
right?
And I don't know if it's they're being reminded that somebody does care for them. I don't know if it's a spiritual connecting point where they go, yes, that is real, and that is important to me, and somebody does love me. I am valued. We don't get that very often in our world today, unless we're intentional about it.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's very true. My guest this morning, Tod Smith, is here. He is a chaplain at San Juan Regional Medical Center, and talking a little bit about the job that he does. And I think I mentioned before we came on the air this morning, your job is one of those, I think, that you can be on call or available almost 24/7 if the need arises. Is that what you find? Or do you try to set some normal hours?
I try to set some boundaries, certainly. When I came in 2013, I joined Art Meyer, who was the chaplain here for 20 years. And Art had done a fabulous job, really, of developing a volunteer team around him over the years. Many of those volunteers had been doing this for 15 years or more, which is quite remarkable. And those folks had a level of training. And I don't know if it was formal or informal, like CPE. It was CPE-like training, certainly, where they were, really having to examine their own interactions with people and how they did, and present verbatims, and learn from each other and those sort of things. But when I became the manager 2.5 years ago, when he retired, it seemed like it was kind of things were happening, and several of the volunteers moved away. A couple of them just said, I'm tired, and they retired. They quit, and I'm kind of down to just a bare bones. And I haven't really been sure. I'm still working a little bit around the idea of developing a volunteer team. I have some concerns about it that I don't know if anybody else does or not. But to me, we don't have volunteer phlebotomists drawing blood. We don't have volunteer physical therapists helping people walk through the halls. But they want me to have volunteer chaplains, and it kind of goes against that, to me, what is it's a professional discipline, and I think people don't realize what that means and what it takes for a person to become a board-certified professional chaplain.
Right.
So I've been a little reluctant to build this volunteer program. I've got a few, and I might try to bring on a few more to help me, especially during the daytime. But those after-hour issues concern me, because if somebody comes in with a gunshot wound, or a child's been injured, those are difficult things to be called into after hours in the emergency
for a volunteer.
Department. For anybody. It's hard for me, but hey, sure. I'm getting paid to do this.
Someone not trained, maybe, too.
Right.
Right.
And a level of training that is required for that, to be able to deal with families in crisis, and to be able to look after the staff during these times and afterwards, to maybe do some debriefing and those things. So I've been a little reluctant to build that team, but and then recently I'm not wearing my boot anymore. I just got it off today at the doctor's office, but I've got some torn tendons in my foot, so I'm on sort of restricted duty right now, and I'm not allowed to take after-hours calls. I'm limited.
See. Okay.
And so I hate that. We've got a bunch of blank spots in the calendar, but when I'm normally up and about, I'm probably taking 2, 4, 8, probably 10 nights a month. Okay. And I've got one volunteer who does take a few nights, and she actually is a good chaplain, has some good training, but still a volunteer.
Gotcha. We just have a couple of minutes remaining this morning, Tod Smith, but I want to ask you maybe for some advice for the rest of us, because and maybe it's just me, and I completely admit that sometimes when I go visit someone at the hospital, I don't always know the right thing to say. Do you have any advice for us when we're there with someone who is maybe suffering or a little down? What would your advice be of how we can we want to cheer them up, of course, but for me, I don't know if I want to talk about what's going on, that they're missing, all the activities that they're missing that they can't go to because they're here in the hospital, or Do you have any advice for us on how we can approach those hospital visits with some of our ill friends?
Yeah, that's and I occasionally will be in a
Nothing
room.
like putting you on the spot for the final
Yeah,
question,
no,
right?
and that's a tough one. I've been in rooms before when family or friends will come in and they'll start chit chatting, and I'll just sort of grimace, thinking, "Ooh, don't go there."
Right.
Assuring them that everything's going to be okay, or God's in control. He won't give us any more than we can handle, and it doesn't feel that way. When you're lying there with your stomach been opened up and that sort of thing.
Right. A bunch of tubes and machines hooked up to you. Sure.
So I guess I wouldn't try to paint any kind of a picture that I don't know anything about. You come into a room and here's a patient. Find out what they're thinking and just say, "How are you? What's going on? What do you need? What can I do for you? How can I support you while you're here?" Anything of a practical nature, who's feeding your dog, those kinds of things.
Right, sure.
But yeah, I would just, avoid the sort of flippant, everything's going to be okay, everything happens for a reason. And, those are the things that just sort of would make me mad at God, I think. If I heard somebody saying that to me, I'd be like, well, what kind of reason would God have for having me get run over? That makes no sense. Because honestly, most of the time in the hospital, people are asking the question, why? Whew. And I never have an answer for that.
Right.
And that's an existential, that's the deep spiritual, part of what it means to be a human. Why? Why is this happening? People want to make meaning out of things. They want to have a reason for this happening. And to just kind of listen to them. You don't have to provide that, but listen to them. And just let them know that you care and that you love them. I think that's the most important thing.
That's true. And just being there, I guess, too, could also work wonders.
Well,
Not even just sitting quietly next to somebody.
Yes,
and that be
a
something?
good, one of the starting points of chaplaincy in providing spiritual care is what we refer to as just simply presence. And it's sort of an esoteric concept in some ways because, well, what do you mean presence? I could have my dog sit here and he's present, But there is a connecting that takes place if you're just quiet. You're with them. Maybe you hold a hand. Sit close enough. Don't stand over them. Don't sit in the corner. Pull up a chair. Don't be afraid. And that kind of closeness, that human connecting is so important. And at that point, you're providing some spiritual care.
There you go.
Yeah.
Todd Smith, thank you for coming in this morning.
My pleasure.
It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Todd Smith, the chaplain at San Juan Regional Medical Center, my guest here on KSJE. We'll be back with more in just a moment, everyone.